All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about a really crucial chapter in India's freedom struggle, one that sometimes gets a little lost in the shuffle: the Home Rule movement. Between 1916 and 1918, this thing absolutely electrified the country, and it acted as this vital bridge between the early days of nationalism and the massive movements that Mahatma Gandhi was about to unleash. So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll set the scene and look at why the time was right for this movement. Then we'll get into the two leagues that were the engines behind it all. We'll see how they spread their message and how the government's reaction created this massive turning point. And finally, we'll dig into why the movement lost steam and, most importantly, what its lasting legacy really is. You've got to love this quote from Annie Besant. "England's need is India's opportunity." Wow, that just sums up the whole attitude, doesn't it? The First World War was raging, Britain was stretched incredibly thin, and Indian nationalists basically said, okay, this is our chance. The time for waiting patiently is over. It was a bold, new way of thinking. So what created the perfect storm for this new, super energetic movement? These things don't just pop up out of nowhere. The Home Rule agitation was a direct result of a whole bunch of things bubbling under the surface and a real growing sense of frustration. So what was in that mix? Well, for starters, the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 were a huge disappointment. Then, for a while, the political scene was kind of dead. The Congress had its big split between the moderates and extremists. But then the whole game changed in 1914 when the firebrand leader Bal Gangadhar Tilak was released from prison. Add to that the very real pain of World War I. We're talking sky-high taxes and soaring prices, and suddenly the Indian public was more than ready for a more aggressive kind of politics. Now, before we go any further, let's be super clear about what Home Rule actually meant at this point. It wasn't a call for complete, total independence, not yet. Inspired by what was going on in Ireland, the goal was to get self-government within the British Empire, kind of like the status that Canada or Australia had. Okay, so at the very heart of this movement were two incredibly dynamic leaders, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Annie Besant. They knew that the old, slow-moving way of doing things within the Congress just wasn't going to cut it anymore. Their solution was actually pretty ingenious. They created two separate but totally coordinated Home Rule leagues. And their strategy was basically a brilliant division of labor. You can see it right here. Tilak got his league going first in April 1916. He focused on his home turf in Maharashtra, keeping it really tight and well-organized. Just a few months later, Besant launched her league, and it was this huge, sprawling network that covered the rest of India. We're talking 200 branches. It was a really smart way to maximize their reach without stepping on each other's toes. With those organizations in place, the movement just took off like a rocket. This wasn't the kind of politics that just involved a big meeting once a year. No, this was a sustained, year-round campaign of political education and agitation. The whole point was to get the message of self-rule into every corner of the country. And how'd they do it? They used every tool they had. They held public meetings, they turned out pamphlets and newspapers, they set up reading rooms and libraries to help people get politically educated, they even got involved in social work. It was all about connecting the big idea of self-rule to people's everyday lives. This was a brand new, much more intense style of politics for India. And a movement is a really big deal by the people it attracts. And look at these names. A young Jawaharlal Nehru, and even Muhammad Ali Jinnah. These were the future giants of the freedom struggle. For them, the Home Rule movement was like a political training ground that created the next generation of nationalist leaders. But let's be real, not everyone was on board, and it's really important to understand why. Groups like the Anglo-Indians, a lot of Muslims, and non-Brahmin communities in the South, they stayed away. Why? Well, they all shared a common fear that Home Rule would just mean swapping out one ruler, the British, for another, high-caste Hindus. So as the movement got bigger and more influential, you can bet the British government started getting pretty nervous. Their response was to crack down hard. But as we're about to see, this heavy-handed approach was going to backfire on them in a spectacular way and lead to the movement's single greatest victory. The crackdown began. The government tried to suffocate the agitation. They barred Tilak from entering Punjab and Delhi. They forbid students from going to any political meetings. They were trying to stop the movement before it could spread any further. But their biggest, most drastic move was still to come. And this right here, this was the climax. In June 1917, the government arrested Annie Besant. And it was a massive miscalculation. The country just exploded in protest. In an incredible gesture, Sir S. Subramania Iyer actually renounced his knighthood. The pressure was immense. And what happened? Just 2 months later, the British government issued the historic Montagu Declaration, and by September, Besant was a free woman. What a chain of events.
So what was this Montagu Declaration? Well, it was a total game changer. It was a formal statement promising the gradual development of self-governing institutions in India. Think about that for a second. This was the movement's crowning achievement. For the first time ever, the British government had officially said that self-government was the end goal for India. Suddenly demanding home rule wasn't a crime anymore. It was a legitimate political objective.
But here's the ironic part. This incredible success also planted the seeds for the movement's decline. After hitting that absolute peak in 1917, the momentum started to fade as a few new factors came into play, setting the stage for a whole new phase in the struggle.
So what happened? Well, that big declaration satisfied a lot of the moderates. Then the actual reform proposals that came out in 1918 split the nationalists even further. A huge blow came when Tilak left for England, which created a big leadership vacuum. But maybe the single biggest reason was the arrival of a new force on the scene, Mahatma Gandhi. And his new methods of nonviolent mass struggle were about to completely captivate the nation.
So how should we look back on the Home Rule movement? I mean, its active phase was pretty short, but its legacy was profound. You really shouldn't see it as a failure, but as an absolutely essential catalyst that got India ready for the next, much bigger stage of its freedom struggle.
And if you want to understand its impact, just look at this number. By 1917, the two leagues had about 40,000 members combined. That might not sound like a huge number today, but back then, it represented a massive expansion of the politically active class. It created a ready-made base of support for whatever came next. So ultimately, the movement's enduring significance is how much it transformed things. It permanently shifted the focus of nationalism from just writing petitions to real, assertive agitation. It spread political awareness to new places like Gujarat and Sindh. And maybe most importantly, it created a generation of nationalists and an organized, politically educated base that was ready for the Gandhian era of mass struggle. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Was the Home Rule movement a success in its own right because it achieved its main goal? Or was its greatest significance its role as that absolutely essential transitional phase, that bridge that connected the old nationalism with the new, and in doing so, laid the foundation for everything that was to come?